Hi everyone, I'm very excited to be here with Tara, who is a wonderful friend and collaborator, and a psychiatrist who has a pretty strong interest and work in neurodiversity. So, the first question is actually, how would you describe what it means to you to be neurotypical? And really, to whatever extent you're comfortable, I'd be interested in your experiences with sensory processing, communication, and so on, kind of as a neurotypical person.
A good question. I've been thinking about how I want to answer this question. I think we are the way that we experience the world is so unique to each of us as individuals that it's very hard to imagine that anybody experiences things differently than the way we do, right? And so, as a non-autistic person, I can comment on some of the specific things you asked about. So in terms of sensory, I think um, the way I experience sensory stimuli has actually evolved over time. I am um, much more sensitive to loud noises or repetitive, like beeping or horns or alarms, now than I used to be. But I can generally tolerate physical discomfort, and I think some of that comes from having um, been conditioned to put that aside to in the service of medical training. And so I've had to work on tuning into my body and paying attention to what I need and not trying to push through hunger or thirst or fatigue. And that's something I'm still working on. So I think in some ways I'm more sensitive to some sensations, and in other ways I'm working on being more tuned in to my body. Um, and then I think you wanted to ask about communication. Um, as a psychiatrist, communication and learning. Um, Skills related to communication is a really big part of my training. And I think inherently, I really value listening, connecting, understanding where someone else is coming from. And I think have learned ways to do that that work in some situations and don't work in other situations. And I think I try hard to um, pay attention to both the content of what is being shared, but also the way it's being shared. Like if I am able to discern a particular emotion behind what someone's saying, or if I notice that I'm feeling a certain way when I'm with somebody, my training has kind of encouraged me to pay attention to that. And so I think in clinical situations, I'm sort of able to put on that hat and maybe try really hard to tune in. I think naturally I find it a little bit hard sometimes to read between the lines, um, or pick up on kind of unspoken meanings from other people. I think I've gotten better at it, and I've sort of learned some skills to kind of catch myself when things are going off the rails, but I've certainly experienced situations where I sort of wish that I was sort of able to pick up on what was really going on more easily, um, and or like navigate kind of socially complex dynamics. So I think I it's something that I think is a work always a work in progress. Um, and then in terms of sort of what I'm interested in and what I enjoy and my routines, and I've had various hobbies. Like as a child, I was um, convinced that I was really into arts and crafts. Um, my mom is cleaning out her house and has sent us a bunch of books from when I was a kid. And I guess at some point when I was about 6, I decided to make my own library. And so all of my books have like my name and the word library misspelled. So I really like this idea of like organizing something in a way that would be helpful to other people. I don't think I had any customers for my library. Um, and sort of gone through various different phases of being into jewelry making and knitting and sewing and now I'm sort of the most into gardening and I certainly enjoy learning about plants and gardening and thinking about the garden and planning and being out there and being in the dirt and um, certainly wouldn't mind talking about it if people are interested in talking about that subject.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. It's very interesting. And one question, I guess, is a follow-up and no pressure to answer, but how do you feel like some of these experiences are, I think you maybe shared some of the overlap with autistic traits, like having certain interests and certain sensory sensitivities, and also finding certain social situations to also be complex or unclear. How do you feel like your experience maybe differs, like the interest, how would you distinguish your interest from, or do you feel like it is distinguished from, I guess, what are called like quote unquote special interests in autism?
Mhm. That's a good question. I mean, it's hard to really capture sort of intensity in any sort of objective way, but I think I'm interested in a lot of different things, and I can talk about a lot of different things, and I want to know about a lot of different things. Um, and gardening kind of falls in sort of into like a hobby category as opposed to like maybe something that takes up a lot of my time or bandwidth. And um, So I think that distinguishes it from like a sort of kind of autistic trait. But I don't know what it feels like to be an autistic person with a special interest because I don't have that personal lived experience. So it might feel very similar to how I feel about sort of the things that I'm into when I'm into them.
Yeah, thank you. I guess likewise, I don't know what it's like to be non-autistic with a strong hobby, so I've always been
Right.
curious about to what extent there actually is a distinction between the two. The next question is a little bit tangentially related, but how has your perception of autism evolved over time? And then some kind of sub-questions under this are, when did you first learn about the neurodiversity movement? And did you feel like learning about neurodiversity was more of a gradual process, or did everything kind of click in one pivotal?
Yeah, it's a good question. I first learned a little bit about autism in medical school, but didn't have a lot of exposure. And then during my fellowship training, the last year of kind of learning to be a psychiatrist, I started to work in a with a team of people focused on both autism and psychosis. And I got to be part of some research studies. And the research studies really like opened my eyes to kind of the complexities of thinking about developmental conditions and how do you do an assessment? What are you looking for? What does it look like in an 18-month-old versus a 3-year-old versus a 25-year-old? And like just getting to know people who are participants in the studies was really, really fun. I just really loved seeing the families that would come in, getting to know them. You know, you get to see people pretty frequently when it's a clinical study, like maybe even every week or every other week. So you get to know people pretty well. And I realized how little I knew truly about autism, despite having done 5 years of training, that there really was so much to learn. And so that sort of sparked my interest and then it kind of became part of my career path. And then a few years later was working in a kind of campus setting and heard about an incoming student who kind of called and said like, "Hey, I'm coming to do a PhD program. I'm autistic. Like, what kinds of services do you all have?" And I realized like, oh, we don't really have like a great coordinated like team or like a plan. And in fact, other universities do. This is like almost 10 years ago. And started Googling and like came across like a neurodiversity initiative at another university. And at the time, I didn't really, it's like, oh, I've never heard that term before. Like medical training, like that was not something that I learned 15 years ago. Um, and so started learning more. And it was definitely a gradual process of like learning, growing, getting to know people, making connections to colleagues. I've really valued, Sam, like our professional relationship and, getting to present with you around neurodiversity. I've learned so much. And I think I love the strengths-based approach that and the holistic person kind of framework that neurodiversity can provide. And I think it actually really fits with the way I want to practice psychiatry. Um, and really in a sort of individualized, like patient-centered, like client-centered way, and thinking about uplifting strengths, building in natural supports, like kind of um, reducing the hierarchy and the relationship. And I think that neurodiversity fits in so many ways around that like ethos. And um, it's been a wonderful journey, and it's very cool that like now I sit in lectures that other people are giving, and this happened today. And the, neurodivergent is a term that's used by medical professionals and nobody even blinks. And that was not the case even 5 years ago, maybe even a few years ago, which, may sound really wild, right? Like huge swaths of people are like having this conversation around neurodiversity and like what's the medical field doing, and we sometimes take a little bit of time to catch up, and it's I think we're in a different place. And so I it's been really cool to see that and be a part of that, and I think that it helps us connect to the humanity in the people that we care for in our clinical setting.
Sorry, the mute button was hiding. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that answer. And the next question is, I think you touched on a little bit already, but what do you most appreciate about the autistic community? And are there ways in which working with autistic individuals and developing autism-friendly practices have enriched your own life?
Yeah. At this point, almost all of my clinical practice is in the like the autism space. So I can't imagine it any other way. Um, I am an outpatient person. I really enjoy taking care of people over long spans of time. I've had some people that I've worked with for almost 10 years, or maybe even a little more than that. And I truly appreciate the like authenticity of my interactions with autistic patients. Like people tell me what, as best as they're able, and what they think and what they feel. And if I ask a question that's like ridiculously open-ended, like they'll tell me, and then I revise and I like, okay, that was not a good question. Let me ask a different question. And um I I learn so much from the patients I've had the privilege to work with, not only like interesting facts, right? Like people will share, their knowledge of whatever they're interested in. And I think that's really cool. And I always learn something, but also like, like just the resilience of living in kind of the world that we're in that is not a neuro affirming. a lot of the time and having to navigate challenging school situations or interpersonal situations or job situations or make a big leap and like do something hard and make a transition. And it's um I I think like a neurodiversity framework and thinking about strengths and um trying to support autonomy and self-advocacy um, helps people navigate those challenges. And um, I think that framework lends itself to sort of the values I have, like personally around like trying to be in my own life resilient and trying to learn new things and challenge myself and grow and be okay with like the things I can't change and the limitations that are in place. And so I think it's working with autistic patients is it's fun. It's, enriching. I learn stuff. I think I hope that it's made me more compassionate. I hope it's made me a better communicator. Um, I try to be more direct. I try to be clearer in what I think and what I expect and what I, um, sort of need other people to do, like when I'm in my different roles. And so I hope that um, being mindful of that and paying special attention to that in the clinical space translates to my other roles professionally, but also like as a person.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate that answer. And I think the point about resilience is especially interesting because I think there's a lot of articles out there about how autistic people are often kind of vulnerable to trauma, and sometimes it's been framed as if maybe autistic people are more easily traumatized, which I guess in some ways maybe is true in the sense that if someone is sensitive to, for example, change in routines or certain sensory sensitivities, then things can be distressing for us that wouldn't be distressing for someone with like more typical sensory processing in that area. But I think that there's also a lot of resilience in the autistic community that gets kind of overlooked, because maybe people see the part that to them perhaps seems like a disproportionate reaction, but maybe not the all the other areas that people are being resilient. So yeah, that's interesting. That I don't know if that's exactly kind of the way that you picked up resilience from the community, but it's interesting that you've noted that in some capacity as well. The next question is kind of a jump in topic, but I know you mentioned earlier that you have done work with individuals who are autistic and also have psychosis, and I'm really interested in that. I think that psychosis is so often left out of the conversation, both with mental health and then also neurodiversity more generally. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on really anything related to this, what you've learned from working with people with psychosis, how you'd like to see the neurodiversity movement become more inclusive of individuals with psychosis, and
Mm,
so on.
Good question. I think psychosis can be like really stigmatized or really misunderstood. And um, when I think of like media portrayals, they're often like scary or negative. And I think most of the time that's not the case, right? And I think there's data like, people with psychosis are more likely to be victimized than to be perpetrating harm. And I think the medical community in general doesn't have um, good infrastructure to support people experiencing psychosis, right? There are some specialty programs and certainly pockets of really knowledgeable people, but there's not broad access, right? And then when you have autism and psychosis, then it's sort of even more narrow in terms of like expertise and recognition. And it can be complicated to tease apart diagnostically as a clinician too. So I think, part of me wanting to learn about that was me feeling like, gosh, I don't feel all that clinically adept in picking this up, and I want to make sure that I am not missing something that's really causing distress, and I'm asking questions in the right way, and I'm monitoring, and I'm know what to do to be helpful. So um, there is, the literature does seem to suggest that there's a higher prevalence of psychosis amongst autistic individuals. Don't really know why. Someone smarter than me might have better theory, like a theory. And um, we have medication treatments that can be very helpful. I've certainly worked with people where it's made a tremendous positive difference in their life, and like there are costs and side effects. And so another thing that I've been interested in is sort of how do you mitigate side effects from medications, and um, how do we promote like overall physical health when you have a medicine that might cause weight gain, um, for example? And I think those are really important questions, and they're things that impact people's like actual daily lives. Um, and I think we have a lot of work to do, as a field to sort of figure out the right medications and kind of right treatment targets for this population of people who are experiencing distress.
Oh, thank you. I know you wrote at least one research article, probably more, but I think the title was something along the lines of autism, psychosis, or both. And so I'm kind of curious what you found in that in terms of how you distinguish between, I guess, those three possibilities, whether there's things that you wish other clinicians or researchers took away from it, or maybe misconceptions in the area.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a piece that was sort of meant to be like kind of a review of the literature to date, and um, trying to give other clinicians like concrete um, pearls or tips on how to understand sort of the like clinical presentation. And so um, like historically, like years ago in the DSM-3, autism and psychosis were actually lumped together as the same thing, right? And it wasn't until later that the phenomenology of both were better described. Um, and I think, we tried to describe the sort of areas where it might be confusing or there might be overlap. So, for example, um, you could imagine like if there were communication challenges, if someone didn't know the individual's like baseline and just met them for the first time, they might think like, oh, this person has disorganized speech. They're not able to put, a concrete, like a coherent story together. But if you don't know the baseline, like, and you don't understand like kind of their communication or their sort of other factors, like you may be making a misdiagnosis. So it's really encouraging people to understand like historically, um, how a person has functioned, what was their patterns of behavior like, what was their speech like, their thoughts, their engagement with the world, and if there's been a change, what is that change? And is that change better, like kind of characterized as fitting with psychosis or not? And so I think it's really encouraging us to take really good histories and rely on individuals themselves and their family members and just try to get as much information as we can to try to tease apart um, things that can look similar, kind of on first glance.
Yeah, yeah, thank you so much for describing the study. One question, and this is also kind of a tangential follow-up, so no pressure to answer it, but um, when you've worked with people with psychosis or in your research on the topic, do you think that, I think sometimes there's sort of this idea that psychosis is a complete detachment from reality, and I understand that in some situations it can be, but do you find that on average, or in some cases, the way in which psychosis manifests reflects other experiences of someone's life? Like, do you feel that experiences of discrimination or trauma often influence the specific way in which psychosis appears, or does it seem to be kind of random, completely random, the type of hallucinations or so on
Yeah,
experience?
such a good question. I um I wouldn't, I'm not going to bill myself as an expert, so, but I can sort of think about my own clinical experience, and I've seen both. Like, so I've seen situations where maybe the name of like a voice in someone's hearing is the same name as like someone who bullied them in high school. Um, or what, sort of a visual hallucination seems to look or remind them of someone who sort of was a negative person in their life in the past. And I've also seen it be unrelated. And I think that's where it can get a little bit tricky. Like if it's purely related to a traumatic experience and there aren't other um, signs of psychosis, it might actually be really like trauma related or PTSD related. And so then the pathway towards health is different. Um, but sort of schizophrenia itself requires like kind of a 6 month period, at least 6 months of hallucinations and delusions and a decline from baseline and functional impairment. So you're often seeing more than one thing, like more than one particular symptom. Um, And I've also found that people aren't always comfortable telling me all the things that are happening. It can feel really scary. I think I would assume it's a really scary experience anyways, and to feel like you can't trust exactly what's real or not. And you're right, like it's rarely a complete detachment. It's often like intermittent, or certain situations are more triggering than others, or certain like sleep deprivation or stress, right? Um, and I have found that like over time, like as I've connected with patients and gotten to know them for longer, they're more comfortable sharing like there's this other thing that's been bothering me and this other thing happened. And this is actually the reason why this is hard. And um I think when you go back to like this idea of resilience, I think that gosh, it takes quite a bit of resilience to like just carry on living when a person is having those kinds of experiences. Um, and the kind of mental energy that it must take to sort of second guess and to check and to decide to seek help or not. And seeking help can sometimes be traumatizing itself, depending on where someone might end up, right? Like an emergency department can be really stressful. And so um, I actually also really enjoyed working in the schizophrenia clinic when I was a psychiatry resident. Um, and then I think for some of the same reasons why I enjoy kind of autism. And I just ended up taking a different path based on what mentorship I had and what was sort of available to me. Um, but yeah, I
Yeah.
think I just rambled and I don't think I answered your question, Sam.
No, I thought it was really interesting. So, yeah, thank you. I think you did answer. I think you're indicating that there can be elements um, of someone's life experience in their hallucinations, but that's not always the case, which is a very helpful
Yeah.
answer. Um, one of the next questions is kind of a jump back to autism, although I'd actually be interested in it for any kind of neurodivergence or including psychosis. What resources do you wish were available for neurotypical people, um, or even other neurodivergent people, because there's such a broad subspace that we're all allies to each other in some way, who might be interested in autism advocacy, or I guess psychosis advocacy, but aren't sure of where to start. And then a sub question under that could also be, if you could learn anything about autism, kind of just have a resource magically appear, are there questions that you wish there was sort of the answer to.
Yeah. And what resources do I wish were available um, for like allies, essentially? Um, Good question.
Personally, if I could have any resource, I think it would be a very detailed, like case by case document of different conflicting access needs and how to, uh, I guess, optimize environments or interaction
Yeah.
for those.
Yeah. I was just thinking wouldn't it be amazing to find to just get to live life as somebody else for an hour or a day? Like to just I think that visceral experience of what is this like? Um your idea is more feasible than mine. Um because there's so much that you don't see kind of sort of I know this is a question we're not necessarily going to talk about today, but sort of like the ableism is so built in you don't even see it. And so could how do you make the invisible visible from that standpoint? We talk a lot about kind of a universal design approach and sort of being more clear about unspoken rules. Like, well, what about the unspoken ableism and how are we paying attention to that and how do we dismantle that and how is that hurting all of us? I think is a conversation I would like to unpack, and I think I take part in promoting it as well. I think being part of the system, you inadvertently promote those things that are harmful, um, and I might not even know it. And so I think that could be really powerful. I think more practically, I think more community and more dialogue and spaces of shared understanding and um, I think opportunities to listen and learn um, and to sort of hear perspectives and hear suggestions for ways to reduce barriers to accessibility. Um, could be really interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much. I agree. It would be fascinating if it was possible to like truly be in someone else's perspective, even just for an hour. I think just seeing how the other person thinks or perceives sensory input alone would be really interesting. And the last question is there anything else you'd like to add that I haven't asked about yet?
Hmm, good question. I mean, I think I appreciate you all the work that you are doing and have done. I think um, I don't know if you are sort of aware of the full impact that you made on Duke and the autism program and me and um it's tremendous. And so thank you for making this space available and thank you for sort of being a resource and willing to support other people and willing to answer questions and willing to sort of muddle through probably uncomfortable situations and I think that is has been so valuable. Um and I hope that, you've gotten a fraction of, at least a fraction of what you've given back, to, that we've been able to be helpful to you in some way. So it's really
Wow,
just more of a personal note of gratitude towards you, Sam.
thank you. That's extremely kind, and I definitely think that I've learned a lot from you and yeah, your support of our different research projects as well. So I appreciate that immensely. Um, and I feel very lucky to have had the chance to switch from physics to autism because I know that's not not a jump in research topics that most people have the chance to make. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you again for those very kind words and for the chance to interview you and
Sure.
yeah, taking some time out of what I'm sure is a very busy schedule to answer these questions. So, thank
Absolutely.
you.
Happy to.